Corporate responsibility and human rights. When we talk about corporate responsibility, of course, you already know that we're talking about companies. Companies in the realm of multinational companies, companies that have the influence to do business across national borders, companies that sometimes draw a very thin line between the sovereignty of nations, companies with global influence, global impact, global results, and companies that go the extra mile to do business in the most dangerous, in the most terrible terrains, in terrains where speaking about human rights might not even be an option. Those are some of the companies that we're talking about. But basically what the UNGP has actually done is to ensure that companies are responsible for human rights in the areas where they operate. So basically, when I talk to friends, when I introduce myself as a human rights lawyer, without necessarily saying I'm a business lawyer, a lot of people would know me much more as a business lawyer, a human rights lawyer. But, having to bring this fusion of words together, business and human rights, when people say human rights, basically what are they talking about? They might be looking at issues around the right to life, right to education, right to healthcare, right to, people would think about, you may be looking at issues around maybe a girl child is raped somewhere, for example. They need a human rights lawyer to go all out to ensure that she finds justice. People equate human rights with justice, the ability to deploy the processes that brings about justice for people whose rights have been violated. But beautifully so, what the human rights and business is really about has to do purely, in fact, the pure sense around human rights and business is to make sure that companies are held accountable for their actions, accountable for their inactions, accountable for the things they do and the things that they don't do, as far as human rights is really concerned. I had the opportunity sometime last year to travel to South Korea, and one of my mentors, he's a lover of coffee. And he was like, please, I would need you to get me this brand of coffee, this brand of coffee. If you don't find this brand, maybe you would find another brand. If you don't find this other brand, maybe you will find this other brand. And I went into Daiso. Yeah, I think it was Daiso in Korea. And I went to the coffee session and I saw a lot of coffee brands. I saw coffee from Cambodia, from Colombia, from Mexico. There were different kinds of coffee. I was even so surprised to see coffee manufactured in France, coffee manufactured in Switzerland. It was interesting because there were just different brands of different kinds of coffee. And I began to ask myself, the question that a human rights, or better yet, a business and human rights lawyer would look at when we see those kinds of things, basically, we'll be thinking, in that farm where coffee is a product for export, what's the process? What's the process of deriving that coffee? Just take a minute to think about it. What's the process? What goes on? Are the workers properly paid? Are issues around child labor, are they very predominant? Do we find cases where there is so much disregard for normal ethical business practices in some of those industries? For example, you're thinking about mining. Maybe you think about the Congo, for example. Congo is so blessed with a lot of mineral resources, but is a country that has been ridden with a lot of conflict. Then you begin to ask yourself, the mineral resources from the Congo, the mineral resources from certain aspects of the northern Nigeria, for example, even the south region in Nigeria, are we adhering? Better yet, are companies adhering? Are companies adhering to business and human rights principles? This is basically what the UNGP has come to resolve. Better yet, has come to expose, because the UNGP is exposing the fact that companies have to take responsibility. Enough of the era when companies could do the things that they wanted to do without necessarily taking responsibility for certain actions and inactions. So this is the beauty of human rights and business. What is the corporate responsibility? I'm very sure right now that I would have some CEOs watching this video. You might actually believe that your company is a very small one and you don't necessarily have to engage in, this whole business and human rights principles. Some people might even think that it's such a fancy word, business and human rights is such a fancy word. It's for those fancy companies. It doesn't necessarily relate to our companies. Our company, we do things on a certain landscape. We should necessarily not be catching the eye of international organizations like the United Nations. Companies might have that perspective, but I'm here to say that it's time. It's time for companies, it's time for corporates to begin to report on human rights, to begin to report on BHR, on business and human rights. The time is now. If you're a CEO, if you're a top executive, you're a member of a boardroom of a company, it's time for you to begin to expound on some of this knowledge that is out there already about business and human rights. We want to see the spirit of BHR in our boardrooms. I know that so much is really going on within the ESG space, but we want to see principles on BHR in our boardrooms. We want to see that our companies are taking more responsibility to ensure that issues around BHR violations, BHR abuses are actually taken very seriously. It's our job, it's my job, it's your job. It's not the job of the advocates like myself, trying to talk about these issues of this nature. It is everyone's responsibility. We must begin to hold companies to account. And I would end by just saying this. I believe sometime last year, there was this story about somebody who walked into, he didn't walk because he was on a wheelchair. He went into a very prominent fast food eatery in Nigeria. And since he was on the wheelchair at the airport, a staff within that organization decided that it wasn't time for him to be served, or better yet, that he should move his wheelchair out of sight so that maybe they might create space for a whole lot more people to be able to access the service. That action might have looked so infinitesimal, so simple, but with very grave human rights considerations, with very grave impact, with very grave repercussions. And it was such a social media buzz. A lot of persons necessarily didn't understand, what the issues were, but people could identify that, okay, this is discrimination of high proportions. This is discrimination. This guy was discriminated against. There was a whole lot of talk here, talk there. But at the same time, I would ask myself the question, that company in question, do they have a BHR policy, a business and human rights policy in that organization that brings to attention of all member of staff or everyone that is participating within the entire value chain of the services that a company renders? Are they aware of BHR principles? The answer is no. A whole lot of companies necessarily do not know that business and human rights has become a thing. It has become something that we should really strive towards. It has become something that it rubs off on your company. It definitely does. When you have some of those procedures, those principles in place, and you have a checklist of certain things that maybe staff need to know, your clients need to be aware of, your suppliers need to be aware of. You have all of that information pack, and people are made aware of what BHR is really about. Trust me, companies will do better. Companies do better when the employees do better. So if companies begin to see the need for companies to act responsibly, and where it is now in the place of the citizens to demand from companies their responsibility towards human rights in their business operations, trust me, a whole lot is going to change. So now is the time. Join the bandwagon. Like this video, share this video, talk about BHR. We can come set up few structures around for your companies so that you can do better and you can adopt globally acceptable standards in running your business. I feel that the moment is now, and you are the vehicle. You are the vehicle to make that change. So please, when next you have that board meeting, that beautiful board meeting, I've attended so many of them, we need to see how we can put the subject matter of BHR for CEOs, for CFOs, for CMOs, for CSOs, for COOs, all the C's, the C-suite executives, they need to start thinking of their business from the framework, from the mental frame, of business and human rights. I believe that's a starting point, and we must get started.